So Esther chapter 2 is what we're going to talk about today. So we talked about how in the last chapter the king Ahasuerus or Xerxes had an experience with his queen, then made a new law that got her out of the way basically. So now the king can have another queen. So he's in the market, if you will, to find a woman to be the queen. And that's what brings us in here to chapter 2. Now, in here, verse 1, after these things, that was all chapter 1. When the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. Then the king's servants had ministered unto him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king. So, verse 3, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins unto Shushan the palace, to the house of the women, unto the custody of Hege the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things for purification be given them. Verse 4, and let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti, and the thing pleased the king, and he did so. So what this is talking about basically is the king's in the market for a new wife, basically, and a queen. So now they're going to send out the princes and the rulers of the provinces to say, gather up the fair virgins, the young women in your area, the beautiful women, bring them together. Virgin doesn't necessarily mean, from a morality standpoint, or someone who has never experienced intercourse or things like that. More of like fair and young, basically. Bring them all together, and then the goal was to bring them in. Now it was very common for kings back then to have uh, a harem, if you will, of women. So these are his concubines. These are, if you think back to the time of King Solomon. So you've got your wives, but then you've got your concubines, and this was that group of women who were the concubines, kind of a thing. In some kingdoms, that's kind of what it was. So they're saying bring him into the woman. There's usually a woman who's appointed to be the leader of these women, basically, and they serve at the mercy of the king and help the king for different reasons and things. And so there is a purification process they go through. And what it is basically is they bring these women in, and not so much a literal purification, but more of we need to beautify the women. We need to, they get to choose what to wear and things, to get dressed up, put earrings on, jewelry and things, because their goal, of course, is to stand out, catch the eye of the king so that you're made queen. Now, this is really interesting because um, if you think about it, let's say you're from a poor family, okay? You're just one of the poor people struggling along in life. You're trying to pay your taxes so the king doesn't send his guards out to kill you or something like that, and you're just trying to eke a living out of the land, basically, and do enough to keep yourself alive and your family alive. And you're struggling. You've got tons of struggles. If you have a daughter, this is an amazing opportunity for your family, because when your daughter goes off to basically try out to see if the king would like her, this is a big deal, because if your daughter gets picked to be the next queen, she now has a lot of favor in the kingdom. And so your family, you become the in-laws to the king, basically, if it's your daughter. So your family has an opportunity to get an elevated status. This was one way to advance. You're still probably poor, but because your daughter is the queen, you have some opportunities. You can go visit your daughter in the palace. You can stay in the palace while you're visiting your daughter. And who's going to argue? Because she's the queen. The only person that rules that can over outrule her basically would be the king. So long as the king likes her, your family is going to have a little bit of well-to-doness, and there's a little bit of wealth that can go your way, and things that build you up, give you. So that this is a big deal. This is a really economically, this is a big deal for a lot of families to have their daughter basically become the queen, so that the family can be improved economically. So there is, from a small person, from the poor person standpoint, I should say, this is a big deal for them. But that's the challenge that they have, is these dynamics. So they bring them in, and they're getting them prepared, basically, here. So we're going to talk about somebody here a little bit in verse 5. Now in Shushan, the palace, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. So Mordecai is from the tribe of Benjamin. You remember, they were the tribe that really shrunk down a lot, that stayed with Judah around Jerusalem, and they've kind of stayed in the city of Jerusalem after the not just the Babylonian but the Assyrian conquest as well. So he says, verse 6, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity, which had been carried away with Jeconiah, the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. Jeconiah, you might say, who's Jeconiah? What's going on with that? Jeconiah is the real name of the person. When Nebuchadnezzar put Jeconiah in, he made his name Zedekiah. So just remember that. That's around 600 BC, basically. So his family lived at Jerusalem and was carried captive into Babylon during the Babylonian conquest. So 70 years earlier, his family, his ancestors, made that journey basically into captivity. So he has been raised in this kingdom of Persia, and he is to be somebody who has an opportunity to talk to the king. He is somebody who the king trusts. He is somebody who works in the royal court and knows the king, basically. So verse 7, he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So what this means basically is, so Mordecai's dad's brother, Mordecai's uncle, had a daughter named Hadassah. That's her more Hebrew name. The other name that we would know her by is Esther. So this is the story of Esther. So his uncle's daughter, which makes them, Mordecai and Esther, are first cousins, basically. When her parents died, both of them died, and we don't know what happened. I don't think I've ever read anywhere to know any story of what happened to her parents. But here's the problem. A single woman with no parents, no dad basically above her or brothers to work with, uh, puts her in a precarious spot, because again, the rules back then were the women had to work through the men in their lives. So, and this goes back even way back into almost Abraham's time frame, when this was that's just kind of the tradition how they did things. So, if her husband died, she would go back with her family. If her dad died, then her older brother would take over the family. So her older brother and her mom wouldn't get married necessarily, but they would co-rule the family, because he would be in a way the senior most male member of the family. So she has nobody, which means there's no family for her. She can't own stuff. She can't do things. So women that were in this situation, basically, they had no family to rely on and to help with. They fell through a loophole in society, and these are the women that would end up becoming poor and being prostitutes and servants, and end up in all kinds of bad situations. So society did not take care of them at all, because of just how these laws were set up. So what oftentimes would happen is they'd have to look for an extended family member to help out, and Mordecai is that extended family member. So he adopted his cousin, basically, and brought her into his home to take care of her, which, if you think about it, says a lot about Mordecai. So one, he's Jew. He is a Jewish person. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. He is pretty faithful in what he is in his heritage. And he's a pretty nice guy if he's taking his cousin in and helping her. So in a way, she joins his household, and he kind of becomes an adoptive father for her, even though they're first cousins, by family. He legally, in some ways, becomes a father for her, so that he's the man that she can work through with making decisions and doing things in society. But that gives her stability. That gives her that opportunity to have a life and not just fall through the cracks and be a nobody. So that's where so Esther is there in his house, and now Mordecai is a leader. He's kind of a servant of the king, basically in the king's court. So he hears about all this that's going on with the bringing in the virgins and the young women to see who the king would want to choose for his next queen. Verse 8, so it came to pass when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together unto Shushan the palace, to the custody of Hegai, that Esther was brought also unto the king's house, to the custody of Hegai, keeper of the women. And so that's like she's like the woman over all the women in the king's house, basically, is what Hegai is. Verse 9, and the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him. And he speedily gave her things for purification, which such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens, which were meet to be given her out of the king's house. And he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. So this is I believe this is actually verse 9 is talking about Hegai. Hegai was somebody who was who pleased the king, and she's over everybody else, basically. Now, verse 10, Esther, oh, sorry, excuse me. Actually, we're talking about Esther. Excuse me. I'm getting ahead of myself here in the story a little bit. So we know Esther's the one that's going to get picked, basically. And so she pleases the king. The king gives her some gifts, and in that kind of a courting period. And so he's the one that she wants, basically. Verse 10, Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. Now, what that's talking about, basically, is Esther got picked to be queen. So there's the marriage ceremony, and there's to be the queen and stuff. But Mordecai's like, don't tell people you're Jewish. Don't tell people that you're a Jew. Because Jews in Babylon, again, were seen as less than. So the caste system that they had back then, you had your wealthy, you had your poor, they didn't intermingle with each other. The amount of wealth you had, who your family's descendancy was, made a big difference. So the idea of racial segregation was just normal life back then. And so being a Jew meant you were lower in the status than you would find for Babylonian women. So to find out that a Jewish woman is now queen and not a Babylonian woman could cause some problems in the kingdom. And that would not be a good thing. So, and for Jews, if you think about it, a Jewish queen means she has an opportunity to voice their concerns to the king. So from a political and economical standpoint, this is good for Jews that the queen is Jewish, because now she might be more sympathetic to Jewish concerns in the kingdom. And because she's the queen, she has an opportunity to talk to the king about the plight of Jews in Babylon. So there's some connections in there that politically give her an opportunity to help the rest of the Jewish nation out. So verse 11, and Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. So he was very concerned, he's keeping track of what's going on with her. Verse 12, now when every maid's turn was come to go in to King Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months, according to the manner of the women, for so were the days of their purifications accomplished, to wit, 6 months with oil and myrrh, 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for purifying of the women. Now, in this this is a year, 12-month process. These women are brought in, and they're treated well. They're probably bathed and cleaned, and hair trimmed, and makeup, and all kinds of stuff that they would do, perfumes and things put on them. They got to choose what they wore. They got to do things to try to, how can I differentiate myself from all these other women to win the king's favor? And it's a long process, definitely a long process to go through. They get to choose different things to put on. It's preparing them, and I'm sure a part of this process of doing this is not just how to dress up. It didn't take them a year to learn how to dress up, but they probably had to learn how to act in the king's court, how to do things, what are the formalities, how to stand properly, how to walk with grace. So I'm sure in a way these were there were classes for these women to go through to learn grace and refinement and how to eat your food, and kind of preparing them to be a queen, basically, so that the king wants to know that these women know what they're doing, so that they can be a queen and they can represent the kingdom properly. So there's probably a lot of that training that went forward into it as well. So verse 13, then thus came every maiden unto the king, whatsoever she desired was given her to go with her out of the house of the women unto the king's house. In the evening she went, and on the morrow she returned unto the second house of the women, to the custody of Shashgaz the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. She came in unto the king no more, except the king delighted in her, and that she were called by name. So all the women were coming into the house of women, and then there was a second house of women. And so they were, when they came through, they would go over to this one, not back to this one, basically. Let's see, verse 15. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go in unto the king, she required nothing but what Hegai the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. So she is not trying to make herself look extra beautiful and sparkly and glitzy and stuff. She's just kind of doing the bare essentials, natural beauty kind of a thing to go forward with this. Not saying she didn't try to look better and try to have some makeup or perfumes or things on, but not trying to get so dazzling and crazy with what she was wearing and how she was conducting herself. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. So it wasn't just the king, like everybody liked her, not just because she was beautiful. I'm sure that in this group of women there was a lot of beautiful women. But Esther probably had a spirit about her, maybe, or a way of carrying herself that was different from the other women that were there. Maybe she had a depth to her. She wasn't shallow. Maybe she was kind to other people. Maybe she had that, she had a personality that was allowed her to get along with people. So you think of the idea of like Cinderella's personality and attitude versus her stepsister's personalities and attitudes. That probably is kind of a similar idea of what happened here. Is Esther was somebody who you could get along with. She wasn't judging others or other things like that. So people liked her. They genuinely liked her. Verse 16, so Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus into his house royal in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast unto all his princes and his servants, even Esther's feast. And he made a release to the provinces and gave gifts according to the state of the king. When the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat in the king's gate. Esther had not yet showed her kindred nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, like as when she was brought up with him. So again, she hasn't told everybody she's a Jew, but now the king's making her the queen and bringing her into his kingdom that way. So there's opportunities, and I'm sure there's gifts that went back with the other women who didn't get picked, things like that were going on as well that were pretty customary back then. Now, verse 21, we're going to hear something here that's really interesting, I guess, to this story. A little different, but does play an important part in the greater story here. Verse 21, in those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth, and sought to lay hand on King Ahasuerus. So what happens here is Mordecai happens to be in the king's gate. So there was, the entrance to the king's palace, those kinds of things, to where the king was. There's usually guards there. These two guards, I mean, all you do is stand there all day long during your shift and just protect, keep the bad people out, basically. They have time to talk, and they probably talked, and maybe they finally had heard that she was a Jew, and they didn't like that. They thought the king should marry, the king was making a bad choice. Maybe they thought the whole idea of pushing Vashti out was a bad idea, and they decided that they were with Queen Vashti, they were supporters of her, and so maybe that's why they were going against the king. But the point is, they had decided to create a conspiracy against the king. This is a secret combination of the two coming together. They wanted to lay their hands on King Ahasuerus, most likely probably to kill him. Most likely. So Mordecai happens to hear of this conspiracy against the king. Now, this was not an uncommon thing. Kings had this all the time. If you read the last book we talked about, book of Nehemiah, you remember that was Nehemiah's job for Xerxes' son Artaxerxes the first was basically to make sure that his glass of wine was not poisoned. So he would check it and double check it, make sure it's okay, and then he would take a sip. If he didn't die, the king would take it. So that was, or he would arrange that. So that was his whole job, is just to make sure no one's poisoning the king, basically. So there was a common worry of somebody killing the king. Having a coup or a secret combination come up against the king was not an uncommon thing, and so they always have to watch their backs. So verse 22, and the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen. And Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. So Mordecai found about this, went to Esther and said, Esther, you've got to tell the king about this. Here's what's going to happen. So she goes to the king and said, hey, my father Mordecai heard about this. He's a servant in your court. He heard about this experience, this conspiracy against you. Verse 23, when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. So the king investigated it, and sure enough, Mordecai was right. So this is going to be a good thing for Mordecai, because now the king realizes Mordecai is loyal to the king and faithful to him. So we'll see that as we jump into these next chapters, as we get into the rest of the story of Esther.